The descent is something that lives in the bones of every woman's journey, whether we have language for it or not. We're diving into the terrain of the dark night of the soul, the underworld journey, and the metaphorical winter, and how those experiences shape us, test us, and ultimately call us back to our deepest selves. If you're ready to discover hidden wisdom and power deep within, learn how to lead from your heart and soul, and have a direct experience of the energies of life with your own body as the portal, you're in the right place. I'm your hostess and feminine embodiment coach, Michelle Lynn. I'll be your guide as we explore together what it means to fall in love with your own aliveness and how to enter more deeply and intimately into life itself. Welcome to the Feminine Mystery School podcast. Welcome back to the Feminine Mystery School podcast. I'm your hostess, Michelle Lynn. We've had a break from the podcast, partly because I've been in my own experience of the underworld, which is what inspired this podcast series we're kicking off today called Mapping the Descent, Dark Night, Underworld, and the Winter of the Soul. Over the coming weeks, I'm so honored to share conversations with 5 women about their own stories of descent. Their experiences are diverse, raw, and powerful, each in their own unique way with their own unique wisdom. My hope is that in sharing these stories, we might start to map the descent together, and that you might find yourself, your questions, your grief, and your courage reflected back to you. Because these stories are not just personal, they're also deeply collective. They speak to our own deep hearts and souls, and they speak to the soul of the world and our shared experience as humans. I just want to make a tiny note on language before we dive in. I'll be using the words God and the divine and spirit throughout this podcast. When I say God, I don't mean an old bearded guy in the sky. With all of those words, I'm referring to the great unknowable mystery moving behind all things. You can insert the words that resonate most with you to refer to that great mystery if you don't like the words God or spirit. Everyone is aware that we're living in a time of collective descent and global unraveling. The pandemic cracked something open in the collective psyche that sent us all tumbling into an upside-down world, kind of like Alice chasing the white rabbit into Wonderland. Our institutions and identities and ways of life, things that once seemed really stable and predictable and foundational, are dissolving before our eyes. And I believe we're still in the midst of that dissolution. We're still in the in-between. We still haven't realized the full rebirth of our institutions and identities and ways of life in a new way. We truly live in catalyzing times of transition. And yet, as timely as this conversation is to our modern experience, this idea of descent is as ancient as time itself. One of our earliest recorded myths is the hymn of Inanna that tells the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld. Long before Christ was crucified and descended into hell and on the 3rd day rose again, an ancient Sumerian goddess descended into the underworld where she was hung on a meat hook before finally being resurrected and ascending back to her throne again. A common metaphor that most people are familiar with that captures this is the transformation of the caterpillar into a butterfly. In the chrysalis, the caterpillar dissolves into goo, and I learned recently that scientists actually call this goo imaginal cells. The caterpillar has to dissolve into a goo of imaginal possibility before getting rearranged as a butterfly. What is this force that dissolves the caterpillar and stirs the imaginal to brew the blueprints of a butterfly? I believe it's the same force that pulls us humans into the underworld, that dissolves what we know to be true, who we know ourselves to be, and then rearranges us anew. We could say the identity of the caterpillar completely changes. What was once a creature of the earth, crawling belly down on the leaves through the soil, rearranges and becomes a creature of the air, flying on the breeze, alighting on flower petals. The ways and concerns of the one who crawled on the earth don't make sense anymore to the one who flies through the air. And I think it's the same for many of us. At times, an invisible hand seems to move into our lives, rearranging everything, especially who we know ourselves to be. And the old ways don't make sense anymore. Part of the catalyzing time we are in right now collectively is that the evolution of consciousness is speeding up. During the liminal time between death of old structures and ways and before the new is born, I believe the veil is thin, that separation between the material and the spirit realms. And with that, spiritual awakening is more available. Many women are waking up right now to something deeper. Maybe it's a spiritual awakening or identity breakdowns or even body-led epiphanies that connect us to our deeper truths. I know from my own path that when you have an awakening, it doesn't lead to enlightenment and bliss as the next step. The next step is often, what now? What does this mean? For those of us having these experiences, we really need ways of making sense of them. Beyond frameworks, beyond rational understanding, what we really need is storytelling, poetry, art, metaphors, and myths. These experiences are soul initiations, and they can't be understood with only the rational mind. Our modern culture has elevated materialism and rationality to a religion of scientism that has essentially exiled magic. And our souls are starving as a result. The soul speaks in the language of symbols and poetry, and there are aspects of our beings that can only be fed and nourished by art, music, and dance and stories. This re-enchanting of life, where we meet our descent through story and archetype and soul, helps us come home to ourselves in a way that analysis alone never will. This is feminine wisdom reawakening. Not only the re-enchantment of life as pulsing with nonlinear, non-rational, magical, creative aliveness, but also this reckoning with the underworld and the experience of descent. As much as the transcendent masculine principle would love to deny the death and decay and composting that happens periodically in nature and in our lives, the descent is not a flaw in the path. It is the path. This is a reawakening to the deep feminine spiritual current that lives beneath the systems of performance and striving and transcendence. It's a reintegration of ancient feminine soul wisdom. We are incarnate beings living in a world of polarity, complexity, paradox, and impermanence. And our souls sometimes crave undoing. If we allow these experiences of descent to really work on us and not just skate over them or dissociate until they pass, they have the potential to feed our souls and give us many gifts. As women walking the wild feminine path and reawakening this wisdom of the soul and body, I believe we have a responsibility to become fluent in the language of descent and death and liminality and rebirth. As women, we carry this wisdom in our bodies. We experience a metaphorical death every month with our bleed. We are biologically encoded to walk between worlds, to bring life through to the material, to knit a spirit into a body. In modern life, and through centuries of repression of the feminine principle, this sacred wisdom has been lost to us. But we only need to begin to remember. Sometimes it's an experience that awakens that remembering. Sometimes it's a story that reawakens it. We'll also be looking at why these soul-stretching, ego-shattering, wildly alchemical experiences are not only common on the spiritual path, but in some way necessary. Richard Rohr says, none of us go into our own spiritual maturity completely by choice or our own accord. We are led by mystery, which religious people call grace. Grace is that hand that seems to move our lives, giving us that push when we need to leave the safety of the familiar and expand our lives and our horizons. We simply won't evolve or transform of our own accord. As Richard says, most of us have to be cajoled or seduced into it, or perhaps we fall into it. We're called, we're fated, or destined. We hear some deep invitation to something more, and we set out to find it by grace and daring. Basically, God has to give us a push sometimes. One of the great mysteries I've been grappling with through this series, and as a result of my own underworld experiences, is why. Why do we have these earth-shattering, topsy-turvy times in our lives? Why do we get pulled, like Persephone, into the underworld? Or swept, like Dorothy, into a tornado and suddenly find ourselves in a different land altogether, having to find our way back to a familiar home? Or fall into a rabbit hole like Alice and end up in Wonderland where nothing is as it seems? Why? It seems to have something to do with the evolution of our souls. And our souls seem to need the material realm of duality and incarnation for this magical, alchemical, evolutionary work to be done. Our bodies want to be safe, but the soul doesn't want to be saved. It wants to be seen and cared for. And we can best care for the soul by allowing ourselves to be shaped by the stuff of life, by mystery and darkness and beauty and, yes, even suffering. In this way, the descent isn't a detour, it is soul-making. To me, soul-making means bringing our divine spirit selves fully alive in our earthly bodies. It's the essence of the work that I do through things like embodiment and archetypal consciousness and alchemy and the feminine arts and magic. We make our souls by allowing ourselves to be cracked open by the vulnerability of the human experience and by love and loss and longing. The descent then is part of this. It's not a punishment, it's a pathway, a way in, a sacred undoing that makes space for something more true. It empties us just enough for God to come rushing in. One of the primary tenets of magic is as above, so below, as within, so without. I believe that the divine is evolving itself too in some way, just as our souls are evolving. And the divine seems to need our participation as individual human consciousnesses in bodies to do that, to evolve itself. Our spirituality and our connection to the divine also seems to need to evolve in its own way too. We might start out with a youthful spirituality that believes God is good and wants good things for us, and if we're good, we'll be rewarded. Eventually, that sweet spiritual innocence gets shattered when something bad does happen, seemingly beyond our control. We or someone we love gets sick or hurt or dies, or we simply wake up to the suffering of the world. In those moments, we are forced to reckon with the darkness of life, and our spirituality has to evolve and grow to make sense of it. We need a new version of God that makes space for the fact that bad things happen to good people, and that there is darkness and evil and suffering in the world and in our own lives. We have to mature our spirituality. There's something bigger and deeper and far more mysterious at work. We have to learn to forgive God, to understand God beyond the dualities of light and dark, good and evil. These experiences of descent seem to be a catalyst for an inner alchemy that calls us into grace and compassion and humility and a kind of peace and ease in life. Those divine qualities that we admire in the enlightened masters and saints and sages and mystics. We seem not to be able to arrive at those deeper shores without encountering some storms on the journey, without walking through a certain kind of fire. One of the things I want to tease apart in this episode is the language that we're using for the experience of the descent. It's sometimes referred to as a dark night of the soul, sometimes as an underworld journey, and other times people use the term winter. These are overlapping experiences, and the words are sometimes used interchangeably, but they have some really distinct differences. Let's start with the dark night of the soul, which is an experience famously described by the 16th century Christian mystic, St. John of the Cross, in his poem by the same name. The dark night of the soul is a moment or a season where the soul loses all sense of divine connection. Your spiritual tools stop working, your faith, your practices, your very sense of meaning, they all go dark. You might feel bereft of God, wondering if God has abandoned you. It's not depression exactly, though it might feel like it. It's really at the heart of spiritual desolation. The sacred goes silent, and yet something is happening in that silence. The dark night is not a clean and tidy passage. It's wild, it's disorienting, especially for those of us accustomed to spiritual clarity or to navigating by daylight. The dark night of the soul can feel really terrifying. We might wonder if we've lost our way completely. We might fear we'll never find our way back. St. John of the Cross describes that passage as complete darkness without light or guide, save that which burns in the soul's heart. We long for God in that experience because we feel that God is not there. It is that inner flame of longing for God that becomes our compass. When everything else is stripped away, we're left only with our desire for truth, for love, for the beloved. As Mirabai Starr writes in her commentary on the dark night of the soul, she says, "Take my juicy spiritual feelings, beloved, and dry them up. Then please light them on fire. Take my lofty spiritual concepts and plunge them into darkness and then burn them. Let me only love you, beloved. Let me quietly and with unutterable simplicity just love you." What she's saying is that something in us does welcome these experiences. Though the rational mind might protest, something in our depths knows that deep truth and love is stirring. These are really beautiful metaphors, but the truth they carry is very challenging. It means that this experience of confusion and emptiness and spiritual desolation is the very terrain in which the soul comes into union with the divine. This understanding of the dark night is a map from the soul's own experience, not from God's viewpoint, but from the messy middle of being human. The dark night reminds us of a paradox. Spiritual life often involves a descent, and the descent is where God meets us, not in spite of the suffering, but within it. Still, not every struggle in our lives qualifies as a dark night. Hardship doesn't always mean spiritual reorientation. I've personally had many experiences of challenge and disruption in life, and I'm sure you have too. And you'll hear the same from the women I speak to in this podcast series. But not all of these experiences are dark nights where we lose sight of God, like Jesus crying out on the cross, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" I've personally only had 2 experiences that I would call a dark night of the soul, one of which was when I had a spontaneous spiritual awakening at age 36. I grew up Catholic, and I always felt connected to God in some way. In my teens, my dad's job brought my family to Turkey, and living there really shifted my connection to the Catholic Church. Christianity says you have to come to God through Jesus as your savior. And yet here I was in this Muslim country as a young woman, wondering how these millions of very devout people were not going to heaven because they don't worship Jesus as God. I mean, these were people who stopped what they were doing to pray 5 times a day. It just didn't make sense in my mind, and it shook the very foundations of my spiritual life. I fell away from religion and spirituality. I wasn't an atheist. That wasn't when I had the dark night. I always felt the presence of the divine. I just didn't have a faith tradition I resonated with, and so for many years it just wasn't a priority. It wasn't something I gave much attention to or thought to. I married a Catholic man, and I started going to church again because it was important to him, even though it still no longer held any resonance for me. And then our daughter turned 7 and started preparing for her first communion to receive the body and blood of Christ as sacraments. As part of that process, she had to go to confession, which is where you tell a priest your sins and get absolved by him. Oh boy. That was the match that lit a roaring fire inside of me. Something absolutely flipped within me. Why does my sweet, innocent 7-year-old daughter need to go sit alone in a room with a strange man and tell him about all the bad stuff she thinks about and does? What on earth? Something snapped in me. I basically rage quit the Catholic Church. I just couldn't participate in it anymore. And I was so angry with God. That experience sent me into a dark night of the soul where I really completely lost sense and sight of the divine. There were other things stirring in my life at the same time as well, but this one thing was the catalyst. I simply couldn't forgive God at that time. I wanted nothing to do with the God of my childhood, but I also felt bereft of God. I wasn't just chilling in that dark night. I was wandering and searching, led by this desire, this longing for things to make sense, for truth, for meaning making. That lasted for many months until I had a spontaneous spiritual awakening sparked by Kundalini yoga, and my life was forever changed. Okay, so now let's talk about the underworld journey and how it's different from, but overlapping with, the dark night of the soul. An underworld journey is something altogether more mythic and primal. This is the realm of Inanna and Persephone and Psyche, the dark goddesses who walk between the upper and lower worlds. In the underworld, you don't just lose faith, you lose your name, your roles, your identity, your ego structures, just gone. It can feel as though you're stripped bare. The underworld isn't just dark, it's active. It demands that you confront shadow. You might have to burn in the fires. You might have to die to what's no longer true. It's messy. It's embodied, it's psychological, and it's deeply, deeply mythic and archetypal. This is the place where we meet our rage, our grief, and ultimately our power. Unlike the dark night, which is often spiritual and contemplative and maybe even internal, the underworld is an initiation that reshapes you. This deep invitation, this call to descent and embodiment and shadow, is part of what it means to reclaim the feminine path. Just like the moon and the seasons in nature, we are called to the darkness. Death is not the opposite of life. Death is very alive and part of the cycles of the feminine. And just like with the dark night, not every challenging life experience pulls us into the underworld. For example, I had cancer in my 20s, but I didn't relate to that experience as an underworld journey, even though I did confront death. Maybe that's partly because I didn't have the awareness or language for what was happening to me, so it didn't work on me at such deep levels. Maybe it was my youthful optimism that kept me afloat in the upper world. Maybe I didn't have the wisdom to allow it to unravel me. That's the thing. Many people resist the undoing that these experiences offer. They deny or dissociate or medicate in various ways so that they never fully arrive in the underworld. In the myth, when the goddess Inanna journeys to the underworld, she arrives there completely naked, having set down all of her royal regalia, all of the armor and the talismans of her power on the way down, like her crown, her breastplate, her beads, and her robe. Most of us go into these experiences thrashing and clinging to our power amulets, whatever they are. It might be roles or identities, a job, a way of being, a religion, relationships. And yet we can't really receive the full medicine of the underworld if we're busy keeping control of everything. One of the themes that you'll hear in the women's stories in this series is that of surrender. Most of us don't know how to surrender well, to let go. Sometimes these experiences teach us exactly that. We aren't in control, and maybe we don't have to be. Maybe if we let go enough, that mysterious hand will move into our lives and dissolve us into imaginal goo like the caterpillar and rearrange us into something entirely new. I just came out of a long underworld journey that started when I had appendicitis in October of 2022 that I struggled to recover from. And this underworld journey culminated for me with the eclipse season last year in 2024. When I had pneumonia, but again, I struggled to recover from. During that whole 2-year period, I was very, very unwell, physically, emotionally, and mentally. It's not an exaggeration to say that I had to struggle nearly every day to maintain my tether to the earth. I was barely functioning for a lot of that. And during that period, I literally dissolved and got rearranged on every level. We had a pretty traumatic and unexpected international move from London to Texas. My health was in the garbage, and despite doing all the healthy things, I didn't know how to get myself better. I lost many, many things during that time, and some really scary things happened to me. I lost relationships, I lost my home, my job, communities. Really, I lost my way. But it did shift eventually, and not necessarily through anything I did to bring it to an end. These things seem to have their own arc and timing beyond our human workings. It ended when the process was done, and not a moment before. And that's one of the pieces of wisdom you'll hear in these interviews. If you're in the descent, it will eventually end. It's not forever. Although I do want to say, I do think it's possible to get stuck in the underworld, looping on despair like a record skipping. But through hearing these stories of women's wisdom, you can learn how to maintain lifelines to the upper world so that you can ascend again when it's time. In the women's stories, as well as in myths, support is often crucial. Inanna was saved from the underworld with the help of her faithful servant and with Enki, the god of wisdom, who eventually rescued her. Persephone's mother, Demeter, convinced Zeus to let her come back to the upper world for 3/4 of the year. Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz met the good witch Glinda, who gave her the ruby slippers and the spell, "There's no place like home." And the women you'll hear from in this series will also share the things that supported them both to be in the underworld and then to get back out again. We talked about the dark night of the soul and the underworld as distinct experiences, and yet they often arrive together. We can experience both at the same time, or we can experience them separately. The lines kind of blur. We can experience the underworld without losing our faith. Or you might descend into an experience of grief or loss or trauma and find yourself spiritually abandoned. So you're in the underworld and you're having a dark night of the soul. But really, these serve different purposes. The dark night ultimately purifies your relationship to the divine, and the underworld dismantles and rebuilds your relationship to yourself and your power. They're distinct, but in our real lives, they often dance together. And lastly, I want to mention winter, which is not quite either of these. Winter is the fallow season, and it's also a metaphorical experience of descent in its own way. It's our bleed in the menstrual cycle. It's a creative void. It's the new moon phase. It's a time of rest and dormancy, inwardness, and yes, even death, even in a metaphorical way. Winter is similar to and overlapping with the dark night and the underworld, but on its own, it's not an ordeal in the same way that a dark night or an underworld journey is. Winter is a cycle. It's part of the cycle, and it's a cycle that repeats on and on. Although winter can feel uncomfortable to many of us because we're socialized to be outward and productive and on all the time, in winter, you're not necessarily being dismantled. You're being regenerated. Winter can feel empty, but it's not a crisis. It's part of a rhythm. It's what makes our creative and spiritual life sustainable. Understanding the difference between winter and a dark night or an underworld journey is important. Winter asks us to rest. The others ask us to literally die and resurrect. We can experience winter seasonally. We can experience winter when we bleed every month. We can experience a winter season in our creative life or in our relational life. We might be in different seasons and different aspects of our lives. We might be in a winter season creatively and in a very outward summer season socially. We might even notice that our nighttime dreaming is a kind of winter and that our days have a seasonal rhythm, just like everything else in nature. Winter is feminine wisdom that makes life more easeful and nourishing and helps us to feel our place among all things and creatures. It's feminine wisdom to let things be cyclical, sometimes flourishing and other times harvesting, decaying, dying, composting, and sprouting new growth. If you want to learn more about cyclical living, I have a free 5-part mini course called Moon Cycle Magic, which I'll pop the link for in the show notes that you can Sign up for to learn more about this feminine wisdom of the cycles and how to easily flow through the entire cycle. So, I'm curious, where do you feel like you are right now? Maybe you're in the underworld, being stripped bare. Are you in a dark night, waiting for the divine to speak to you again? Or maybe you're in a winter, quiet, cyclical, being prepared for what's next. If you're going through it right now, I hope these conversations will be a balm and a lifeline of women's wisdom for you. A sister's hand reaching out in the dark to reassure you, you're not alone, you can do this, and yes, this too shall pass. Or maybe you just remember these experiences in your own life and the series will give you a better way to make sense of them. Wherever you are, wherever you find yourself to be, I hope that you know this. You're not lost, even if it feels that way. These are not signs of failure. They're signs of initiation, of soul making, of being called deeper into the wild truth of who you really are. So stay tuned for next week when we kick off the first of 5 conversations that will help us map the descent together. Until then, wishing you many deep and wondrous happenings. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please leave a review. It really does help get this podcast in front of more people. And come check out my offerings at embodiment-alchemy.com. If you're a way shower who wants to fully express your gifts in the world, then Force of Nature is for you. I mentor leaders, creatives, and messengers who are here to dream a new world into being. If you know you're here to lead, but want to do it in a new way that reflects your deepest held values and truths, and honors your feminine being as a source of power in its own right, I can help you. Many times, leaders and way showers feel their insides don't match their outsides. They want more clarity about their gifts and role in the new paradigm. They want access to deeper sources of intelligence and support getting unblocked so they can show up more powerfully. If that resonates, you're exactly the kind of person I do my best work with as a coach. Come check out my bespoke mentorship, Force of Nature, for women who want to move the world. The link for Force of Nature is in the description for this episode, or you can head to embodiment-alchemy.com to find out more.